Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Centric. This being a show where I talk about TV shows that are crime dramas. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about A Murder at the End of the World, Season 1, Episode 6. Great episode. A lot of really interesting things went down in this episode, so let's break it down. Okay, so I'm going to throw this out here early on in the recording, and I'm going to kind of break down the episode and kind of give you my thought process. Is there a possibility that Zoomer might be the killer? I don't know if anyone else has suggested that. I'm just throwing that out there because of certain things in this episode. The one that jumps out to me immediately was like, oh, there was no one on Bill's camera when he opens the door. All you see is the light change. But part of me, there is someone being like, hey, what if the person digitally removed themselves? Which it's a strong possibility, but immediately across my mind is like, well, what if they're too short to pop up on the camera? Like Zoomer. Like, what if it's something as simple as that? So, Occam's razor, right? So, that's one aspect of that, plus like what we learned about Zoomer in this episode, more particularly what we learned about Andy and what that can mean for Zoomer in the grand scheme of things. So this is where I was like, let's go back and kind of break things down. Normally I start off with the past stuff, but I'm going to integrate that, as we kind of break the story down beat by beat. We immediately pick up with Darby with the tarp, or the covering of the water, and then like we see a blurry version of someone walking away. I'm like, oh, is that the killer? I'm like, who could it be? But then I was like, could it be Lee? But then they came back, so I was like, oh, you're not the killer because you're trying to save her. And then all of a sudden she's also being like carried by David. I was like, wasn't expecting that. Then he's getting all huggy with Lee, so I'm like, oh, so you guys are in this together. I was like, wait, so is David not the douchebag that we think he is? I guess that's kind of the whole point of like people presenting a certain way and actuality being something else. But we find out the truth behind the Andy and Lee situation. Turns out Andy's very, very abusive and he's very possessive of Zoomer. Controls, because that's where, like, I'd brought it up previously. I'd wondered, like, the whole very strict diet and stuff like that about Zoomer. I was curious if that was some correlation or connection to the fact that maybe it has something to do with Bill having maybe some food issues, but none of that had ever really come up before, so that's why I was correlating, like, maybe there was something there, like, why he was very picky about, but it's like, no, it's about controlling Zoomer in so many ways, because Andy's not only treating Zoomer as his legacy, Zoomer's everything. Zoomer's supposed to be, like, I think, the next version of him. I don't know if it's going to go this full sci-fi, but if we were, like, leading into the real, like, fully leaning into like dystopian sci-fi of it all, you could easily see a thing of, hey, I want to live forever, so I'm building up my next body. I'm going to imprint my brain on. It's like it's probably not going to be that to that extent, but it is going to be to some extent, because like in a more metaphorical sense, not in a literal science fictional sense, maybe in a metaphorical sense, because he wants Zoomer to be him, to be better than him, because it's like, you are going to continue my legacy. That was a whole conversation last episode, and maybe on some level, because he made the point of, Bill supplied the hardware, the seed, and I'm the fundamentals. Everything that Zoomer is me, and just like, egotistical, wanting, putting. Maybe there's a little bit of nature there, so there's always going to be a little bit of ego of like, oh, you want to procreate, so there's a version of you that exists that you never truly die. But Andy is egotistical, saying himself as kind of the savior of this world, or at least being the lifeboat to whatever's left of this world, right? So there's an element of that. And I think that need for perfection and just fault, like, he takes it all out on Lee. So we've seen he's hit Lee, and even Zoomer's seen that. And for her, it's like that she was so isolated, and I think for her it's a situation of, she even says it, I don't want Zoomer to like be around that, because he's witnessed it far too many times, and that stuff stays with children. Like, whether or not they fully understand it at the time, that leaves like a psychological imprint on them. And so she wanted to protect her son from that. So one day she decided to run. She had all this set up. The fake ID she has, the black hair she has, is because she tried to run. she found someone who was about her same size with brown hair who also had a son. So when that person's license was about to lapse, she came in and kind of been like, oh yeah, I'm this person, and got the license and all that. And they ran. She drove for 18 hours to meet up with her reporter friend, and it's like, yes, we did it. And lo and behold, who's there waiting? And even to this day, because we don't know how long ago that attempt was. Zoomer looks like he might be. It's hard to say. That could have been like a couple months ago. This, because that seems like that feels like that could be super, super fresh. So for her, it was like, I need to. This was my chance, and it still doesn't even know to this day how Andy figured that out. She did a lot to cover that up. So she hid our identity from like the camera so they wouldn't be able to identify her. She did all the necessary work. She knows enough to be able to hide from Andy, but it's like maybe he found a very low key approach to. It's like maybe he had someone following her. Like once again, maybe she was so preoccupied on the tech side of things of like, oh, tracking through cameras, my phone, that she never thought about the more low key. But it's like, to be able to already be there ahead of time, like it speaks volumes of like, that's not just following me, you predicted where I'd go. Part of me wonders, does that have to involve Ray? Because that's another possibility that was kind of thrown out there early on of, are we dealing with a killer AI type of situation? Especially with what Bill describes, the Frank Bell, which we'll get to, about faulty programming. Like I said, we'll get to that. Like, it feels like there could correlate to some race stuff, which, like I said, I'll try and talk about more when we get there in the story. But Andy told Lee, you can go, but Zoomer stays. Like, if you want to leave, leave, but Zoomer stays. And for her, it's like, I'm not going to let my son stay under Andy. Like, I don't know what my son will turn into in that byproduct. And it's like, also, it's my son. And she even says, Andy always said, my son, never our son. Which she kind of let that slide because it's like, hey, he loves Zoomer, but now he's become obsessed with Zoomer. And it's just Zoomer is his entire focus. She even admits it is that sad abusive situation, that kind of Stockholm syndrome of she's trying to get away from Andy, but there will always be a part of her that loves Andy. And like, she takes a lot of fault on this because Darby's like, I'm sorry, like, you were trying to get away and I kind of led him straight to you. She's like, maybe that's why. Well, Darby was coming at it more so from the perspective of, I'm trying to find this killer because Andy actually is like, has nothing to do with this potentially, and he actually needs me to find a killer because this is disrupting what he's trying to do. I think he could probably care less about literally every other single person, but the person he cares about most is Zoomer, and Zoomer could be in danger, so that could be enough provocation for him to like insist on having Darby's help. But Darby uses the thing that Sean told her last episode of, yeah, it'll be too easy to blame yourself. And because I thought she was going to come from the perspective of like, well, it's Andy's fault. She was coming from the perspective of, you were doxxed, you felt unsafe. That's why you turned to Andy, because this is someone that was rich and powerful you thought could help protect you from like the ugliness of the world. And you just found yourself in that same vulnerable situation again, being doxxed and controlled by like some outside person. This time it's just someone you were with. You just exchange that situation for another without realizing it, It's like going from one abusive relationship to the other, not because saying you deserve it or anything. It's just that you thought like, oh, I'm getting away from this, and maybe you. I mean, and I think people like an Andy are very good at hiding that type of stuff. They want to be that person that seems so good for you, but especially when you're in such a vulnerable point, maybe you just don't see a lot of the cracks that were already there, or maybe it's just Andy's just that good at like concealing those cracks temporarily. So by the time you actually see him, you're already into deep type of situations. But for her, she knows the moment this place is fully done, that the area they were in last episode, they even showed it again, and it's like when Darby came down to see them and confront Andy about Bill, that would be enough, that would be their lives forever, that they'll be trapped there because there'll be no leaving ever again. They've already trapped, they'd be even more trapped. You wouldn't be able to do anything because you wouldn't be able to leave that area. I mean, that place would essentially become your prison and your tomb. It always has been, but even more so, you'd be even more cut off from the world. And Lee talks about David's involvement in this is that he saw some of Andy's abuse firsthand, and I think that's what motivated him. Which is interesting too, because there was a whole conversation last episode about David's motivation being that he didn't like Lee. Like if he was, it was the episode before. It was episode 4 where Sean was like, if David was going to kill anyone, it would be Lee because he didn't like the attention she was taking. But maybe on some level, David was trying to get Andy's attention so much so he wouldn't focus on Lee. Because that means, I wondered, that must mean that Sean never saw that side either. So it's always that interesting thing of like, how much do people notice and how much do people not, like, do you notice something but you don't really think much of it and you brush it off? Because even Lee was like, yeah, it's a little here, a little there, but it became more and more and more and more until now things are what they are between Andy and Zoomer, that he's become so obsessed with Zoomer. So I don't know. It's interesting. It does make you wonder, did Sean know? And probably didn't. But it also turns out Bill never had any intention of coming here, because Lee's perspective on it is she thought Andy invited Bill just to keep one of his biggest critics nearby, but it's like, no. To fully understand Zoomer on so many levels, you got to trail it back to the root of the DNA. By learning more about Bill, you understand Zoomer in a way you could never understand him before. You needed to get the full fundamental picture so that you can, I guess, understand him fully and also maybe warp some of those Bill qualities and elements into more you, so that Zoomer will become fully you and less Bill on some fundamental levels, and even stuff that like Bill had nothing to do with, but just some innate stuff about him that Andy wanted to kind of erase to make more him inside of Zoomer. And it's just like the only connection Bill and Zoomer would ever have would just be the DNA. Maybe that's the perspective on it. But at the end of the day, Darby being invited, she finally figured out why I'm here. My invitation was purely for the purpose of drawing Bill here, because Bill was never going to say yes until he heard that Darby was coming, and that made him go yes. Like, she's like, I was the bait. In fact, this whole situation inspired Darby to kind of look at this investigation from a different point of view, because she's been so focused on trying to understand the killer and figure them out that she hasn't taken time to fully check out the victim, because I think it's just because it's such a raw thing to look into the person you care about so much. But it's like, right, there's been 6 years you guys haven't talked, so I think she's just been a little too afraid of, just because it connects with how they didn't end off on the best of terms 6 years ago and just the last moment they had together present day. So I think a lot of that motivated her not to kind of pursue the investigation from that perspective. So it's like, you kind of, in an investigation, kind of have to look at things from all sides, not only just from the killer's perspective. By understanding your victim more, you can understand them and try to figure out the motive and who would gain the most from killing Bill. So not only Lee and Darby, but also Oliver, who came because David told him, like, yo, like, because no one's going to pay attention to Oliver. He just, I guess, like, the way he even says is, it's kind of like a I'm invisible type of situation. No one's going to really notice me, so you can trust me. So he goes along with them because he's like, I don't want to be alone. I've been stuck inside my room all this time, just worried about whether or not I'd be the next person, just living like that and be alone. Because, I mean, the entire group is just isolated because everyone's on lockdown in their respective rooms, I think, back on lockdown. So he didn't want to be alone. So they go to Bill's room, and we kind of run through what happened to Bill. It took him moments to realize that he was in the process of dying. And he hit his head, and the first thing he grabbed, didn't even go for the phone, he grabbed the book. It's like he knew Darby would come, and he was hoping to leave her some kind of clue. And so the blood is around the last page, because they're the last chapter is typically what Darby ends up reading. So Bill would probably know that. She does enough public readings that he'd pick up on that. But there's something maybe specifically in the back of the book. As she even says it herself later on, she's never finished. She's actually never read the final bits of her book since she wrote it, because it's just a reminder of all the mistakes she made, because she would have to face all the ways she left Bill before he left her. But anyway, getting into it, we finally get the full context of the story. That moment we cut away from in episode 1, we finally get the end of it, and yeah, Frank kills himself. And just that like the sound design of it all too, where it's just like Bill's ears are ringing so hard that the dialogue is muffled, and it like Darby's trying to talk to him. He's like, "What are you saying? I can't hear." And he's covered in blood. She gets to watch like it was like a washing machine or a dryer, and uses it to leverage herself up to go up the stairs. I mean, I was expecting her to use that to kind of get. I guess none of the windows are big enough for any of them to slide through, so they had to climb upstairs, and she saw the dead body. Who knows what Bill saw? But she went to a neighbor's house to call the cops, and we cut back to that hotel scene, and we get the full context of it. Bill washing, and I was expecting him to kind of be breaking down. It seemed like that was kind of the context. I think that's what I took from it. But all in my recollection of the scene, all you see is that moment where Bill looks and turns to her in the tub. That's all you see. But I think in my head, I had contextualized that as like, oh man, Bill was having a nervous breakdown in a tub. Probably was, but he kept that a lot to himself. But they're in the tub together, and I think Darby not knowing how to like process everything herself, like she kind of like compartmentalizes it all in a way that Bill wouldn't, and there's just been a lot of compartmentalizing on Darby's part that just hasn't been very cohesive with Bill. And she's there trying to understand, like, did you see his face? It's like Bill's like, no, and she's like, I didn't either. I'm wondering in that moment, did he already decide what he was going to do or what? And I was like, that feels very poetic when you look at the Bill side of things, because knowing what Bill does, that he leaves, I'm looking at it and thinking to myself, ironically, I'm like, that look in Bill, maybe that's also why it hits Darby even harder, because the same question she asked about Frank Bell, same thing could be asked about Bill. Did he already know in that moment he was going to leave, or was he planning something else, and then events changed his mind? And it's like, ironically enough too, because they were laying next to each other, he kind of looks to the side a little bit towards her. She's kind of turned a little to him, but rather than like talking or saying anything, she rolls back over. She didn't see his face fully, so that's where I feel like that was meant to be. I could be overreaching. I could be reading too much into that, but I feel like that was meant to be very poetic in that regard of like, but yeah. Darby focused a little bit too much on a killer, but Bill's like, what are you talking about? He doesn't matter. He's just some faulty programmed killer. Like, you want to look at it like there's some special reason for why, like he was special or something. It's like, no, he was just faulty programming like any killer. There was nothing to it. Like, at the end of the day, I know what I'm feeling because we almost died. What are you feeling, Darby? And she's like tired and just leaves. Because I think it's just for her, she's scared to admit how she feels, and it's easier to defer to all of this. Like, that's why I think she focuses so hard on the investigation, because it's easier to play the role of detective rather than just be Darby Hart, is what I think is what that comes down to. It's easier to kind of put on this different mask, and rather than showing someone who you are underneath. And I think she was scared, just like I had brought it up in last episode when Bill was talking about like the moments he knew that he loved her, that she was kind of reluctant to talk about. She was like, no, it's stupid, it's whatever. It's because I figured she was kind of scared and embarrassed to admit it, which she eventually did, but it took a little prying to get to that point. And she knew like, oh, I need to do this because she does love Bill, but the problem is she just couldn't make those steps forward for whatever reason. And, you know, when he left, he destroyed his computer and his phone. He dumped him in the tub, so she not only couldn't she contact him, but she also wouldn't be able to track him. And it's interesting. I wondered if she must not have known anything about Bill going, because I'm trying to remember at the beginning of the episodes when they were like, oh, Bill is Fangs, like that's his moniker, like with his artwork and stuff. So at the end of the day, could she have tracked him down? Did she ever try to? Maybe she still did over the course of those years, but just was never successful. Had no starting off point. But it is interesting. Maybe that had always been there, but they made a short point to show it now that on his computer it said Fang. So I'm like, I guess like I don't know if that was just something he wrote up there, like that was always going to be his moniker, or maybe it's a particular type of computer. I don't know. Whatever the case may be. I don't think we had seen that before now, but maybe we did. But Darby breaks down both in the past and present day. I even love Oliver's line, like, Oliver has no tact, and it's just being like, yeah, it's like throwing up, it's a good thing, because that means you're not supposed to keep it in, because, like, if you do, you'll be a old bitter bitch or something like that, and there's, like, adding some levity to the circumstance. But Oliver himself focuses on that particular line of, like, right, faulty programming kind of happening over and over again. That's like any killer. So they're interpreting that as, hey, what if they're talking more like, okay, this is a hacker, then it has to be Lumet, because smart cities isn't just about, oh, lights that turn on automatically. It's about being able to track everyone, which obviously is a very, the government control in China obviously is what it is, and you add in a technological element that would allow you to track people even more. So, I mean, I think technology is already like that in China, isn't it? Like, they can track people all over the place. That's my understanding. I don't know. I'm speaking from an outsider perspective, and no, I'm not well versed enough on, like, how China operates with its people. To some extent, yes, but not to the full extent. I'm not well versed enough. But I think they're taking that a little too literal in the sense of hacking, but when they should be talking about DNA, because what is DNA? What is, like, what makes up a human? Is, I mean, the mind is a computer, so we're talking DNA in a more faulty wiring, programming type of thing, like, you know, because your brain is like a computer. Like, you can say, like, someone who is not all there, like, who is a little maybe psychopathic or anything, a sociopath could have faulty wiring in their brain. So I think there could be considered faulty programming. So I'm looking at it more like that. But if you want to go at it from the technological advance, I could be like, well, arguably you could be like, it could be Ray, because they also indicated, like, right, how he interacted with Darby the first time when she saw him, like, in a more AR approach, like in the first episode. So it would make sense why, I mean, either he could digitally remove himself from the camera because he's technically not there, only Bill could see him, so it could be a Ray situation. Either he's doing that for Andy's sake, because maybe much like Todd, it's like, oh, I do whatever you got to because I love this family. Which part of me wonders, is he? I doubt it. I was about to say, like, could he secretly be on Lee's side? But it's like, no, he's there for Andy and Zoomer. And if Lee's an issue for this family, that'll be a problem. But she's part of the family, but I don't know if she technically counts. But because Todd did say, like, he is someone that supports revenge. When he was talking to Darby last episode, like, oh, I can co-sign on revenge. So, I don't know, maybe Todd's a lot more on their side than we're giving him credit. I'm giving him credit for it, but it feels, that's where I'm currently standing. It's either Zoomer or Ray, not unless there's some correlation between the two. So, to be fair, what is Ray if not Andy's child? And so maybe there's a little bit of that, because that's where I'm like, I keep going back and forth, because I could easily see it being a situation of Zoomer trying to get rid of anyone that's getting away with his family. He wants his family together. Like, that maybe some of that nasty side of his dad, the faulty programming in his father, has been implemented. Because, yes, he's got Bill's DNA, but a lot of what Bill is was overwritten by Andy. Because, once again, Andy is the one with the software. Because Darby isn't remembering that's how Andy described that last episode, the hardware and the software, you know. So it could be that on some level Zoomer has adopted some of his father's issues and he's been secretly killing people, because the kid is smart. So it could just be like he's killing people, people that are getting in the way of his family. So not necessarily like on some Omen shit, but type of maybe something borderlining that. So that's where I'm kind of throwing in there, especially once again the conversation of faulty programming, like kind of recycling itself over and over again, because Andy's faulty programming passed on to Zoomer through nurture rather than nature. So there's that. Then the same conversation probably could be had about Ray. That it's like, right, I'm kind of your child, and I've been this background thing that pops in every once in a while. I've been this voice that's heard everything, that's there to respond to you. He's been kind of Darby's companion through this investigation and stuff in some capacities, and been there to kind of have like these thought-provoking conversations that they had last episode. So there's a lot there. Sadly, at the end of the episode, Andy shows up with Todd and a beaten up David. So he was like, sorry. I guess like he finally broke from the torture or whatever. But some of the other suspects besides Lumet was like, right, maybe Andy killed Bill on purpose, and maybe he's behind all this, because they were also implicating like, well, maybe we're not dealing with just one killer, maybe we're dealing with multiple killers. Then there's also the Ava of it all, because even Lee admits, hey, I think she loves him. Like, after all these times with the treatment, yes, she's obviously in love with him, but maybe he's in love with her too. So maybe she fits that more role. Like, Lee's not who he needs her to be for Zoomer's sake, and sees more of that caretaker vibe from Ava, who will fall in line because she's in love with Andy, so that she'll do whatever Andy wants and she will never question him. So maybe that's kind of what they're kind of setting up and implying. But my two guesses right now is Zoomer and Ray, and I'm just going back and forth about which one that could be. Maybe it's going to end up being neither. I don't know. I'm curious to see how this plays out. The next episode, if I'm not mistaken, is the finale, so it all comes down to this. So it's definitely going to be interesting to see where the next episode takes us with all of this, how this all potentially wraps up. I don't think this is going to be one of those stories that has like an ending where you're just like, I don't know how to phrase it, where it's going to be like an ending where you're just like, oh, that's depressing. Like, I mean, it probably will in some regard, but I think it's going to have like this. I don't think it's going to end depressingly, but you never know with some shows whether or not they're going to sneak something in at the last minute to be like, yeah, and this kind of actually has a depressing ending. It doesn't kind of end off on a like more like cathartic, resolved result that you think it would, but we'll see. I'm curious to see where this all takes us, what the reveals end up being. I have not seen the previews, so I don't know even what to fully expect. I don't want to know. Once again, just putting that out there, because I avoid watching previews as much as possible, because I want to go into these episodes knowing as little as possible. So I'm excited to ultimately see where this goes, where this takes us, how this all plays out, and kind of finding out the truth behind all of this. But really, that's all I wanted to talk about. So the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day, and goodbye.